Thomas Reynolds, a humble Vietnam veteran, navigates his weathered fishing boat, Sea Memory, through Harbor Point's Marina. When a wave nudges his boat against Harold's luxury yacht, the wealthy owner and his guests mock Thomas relentlessly, filming his humiliation for social media. Unfazed, Thomas retreats with dignity, unaware that the harbor master has made a mysterious call. 30 minutes later, a Navy destroyer, USS Michael Murphy, appears on the horizon, silencing the Marina. Why has this warship arrived, and what secrets from Thomas's past are about to surface? The truth promises to turn the tables dramatically. Inspired by Thomas Reynolds' story of resilience and honor? Subscribe to our channel for gripping stories that inspire compassion and justice. Support us to keep sharing narratives that matter. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our community today. Thomas Reynolds stood at the helm of his weathered fishing boat, the Sea Memory, his hands steady despite the years etched into his skin. At 72, his fingers moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had once commanded sophisticated naval equipment through 3 tours in Vietnam. The salt spray stung his weathered face as he navigated the crowded marina at Harbor Point, but his hazel eyes remained sharp, scanning the water with the vigilance of a man who knew the sea's moods better than his own. Those hands, calloused and scarred, had once pulled men from the jaws of death in churning waters far from home. Now, they gripped the wheel of a humble vessel that carried him through a different kind of survival, one day at a time, one fish at a time, one quiet sunrise at a time. The Sea Memory was no beauty, its faded blue hull peeling like an old memory itself, its patched canvas canopy flapping softly in the breeze. But for nearly 3 decades, it had been his sanctuary, a floating refuge where the world's noise couldn't reach him. The morning sun blazed over the marina, casting golden reflections on the polished hulls of luxury yachts that towered over Thomas's modest boat. The contrast was stark, almost cruel, their gleaming fiberglass and chrome fittings mocking the Sea Memory's rust-streaked deck. High tide had stirred the harbor into an unusual frenzy, the normally tranquil waters churning with restless energy. Thomas, ever cautious, steered toward his usual mooring spot, his mind already drifting to the day's catch. But a sudden wave, sharp and unyielding, caught the Sea Memory's starboard side, nudging it against the pristine hull of a 90-foot yacht, the Executive Decision, which had glided into the marina just the day before. The contact was fleeting, a soft bump of rubber fender against fiberglass, but it might as well have been a cannon shot for the reaction it provoked. "Hey, watch where you're going!" A man's voice, sharp and indignant, cut through the morning air. Thomas looked up to see a red-faced figure leaning over the yacht's railing, his crisp white polo shirt and designer sunglasses screaming wealth. Harold, as Thomas would later learn he was called, pointed an accusing finger. "Can't you see? Look at that rusty boat of yours. You shouldn't even be allowed in this marina." His voice dripped with disdain, each word a dart aimed at Thomas's quiet pride. Thomas cut the engine immediately, the Sea Memory bobbing gently in the choppy water. "I apologize, sir," he said, his voice low but steady, weathered by years of storms far worse than this one. "The current's strong today. No damage done." His words were measured, carrying the weight of a man who had learned to choose his battles wisely. He scanned the yacht's hull, noting the faint smudge where his fender had brushed it, a mark so minor it could have been wiped away with a rag. "No damage?" Harold scoffed, his face twisting into a sneer as he pointed dramatically at the smudge. "That'll cost hundreds to buff out. What's your insurance?" His voice grew louder, drawing attention from the yacht's deck, where a small crowd was already gathering. They clutched cocktails despite the early hour, their laughter sharp and careless, slicing through the air like shards of glass. A woman in a designer swimsuit, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, aimed her phone at Thomas, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Harold, look at that thing," she called, her voice loud enough to ensure Thomas heard. "Is that even seaworthy? It belongs in a scrapyard." The crowd erupted in laughter, their voices blending into a cruel chorus. A young man, his expensive watch glinting in the sunlight, began recording a video, his grin wide and predatory. "This'll be gold on TikTok," he announced, his tone gleeful. "Old man's rust bucket versus Harold's yacht." Another guest chimed in, joking about the sea memory lowering the marina's property values, while someone else suggested they charge admission to this floating museum. Each barb landed like a wave against Thomas's stoic exterior, but he gave no sign of breaking. He had faced worse, far worse, than the jeers of pampered strangers. In the Navy, he had stared down tempests and enemy fire. In life, he had endured losses that cut deeper than any insult could. He said nothing, his silence a shield forged by decades of discipline. With slow, deliberate movements, he restarted the engine, the low hum of the sea memory steadying his resolve. He checked the point of contact once more, ensuring no real damage had been done, then carefully backed away from the yacht. Harold's voice followed him, sharp and commanding. "Don't come back to this section," he shouted. "This isn't a dock for fishermen. This is for serious vessels." Thomas nodded once, his face a mask of calm. He had learned long ago when to fight and when to retreat, and this was no battle worth waging. The sea memory glided toward the commercial side of the harbor, where working boats and fishing vessels bobbed in quiet camaraderie. As he maneuvered, Thomas's thoughts churned like the water beneath him. He felt the sting of their words, not because they were true, but because they reminded him of how the world often measured worth, by wealth, by polish, by the shine of things that didn't last. His boat, his life, his hands, they were worn, yes, but they carried a history no yacht could claim. From the dock, the harbor master watched the scene unfold, his brow furrowed with unease. He had known Thomas for years, a quiet man who paid his modest slip fees on time and never caused a ripple of trouble. The old fisherman's dignity in the face of mockery stirred something in the harbor master, a mix of respect and quiet anger. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he made a call, his voice too low for anyone nearby to hear. Whatever he said was brief, but it carried weight. By the time Thomas secured the sea memory at its mooring and trudged toward his small cottage on the bluff overlooking the harbor, the video of his humiliation was already spreading across social media. Clips of the encounter, captioned with cruel hashtags and mocking emojis, pinged from phone to phone, each share a small wound to his quiet existence. But Thomas didn't know this yet. He walked with the same steady gait that had carried him through war and loss, his heart heavy but unbroken. His cottage was modest, its weathered shingles blending into the rugged coastline. Inside, it held treasures that no one in the marina would understand. Photographs of a younger Thomas in uniform, medals tucked away in a drawer, letters from men whose lives he had saved. The sea memory wasn't just a boat. It was an extension of the man who had built a life on resilience and quiet honor. As he sat in his worn armchair, gazing out at the harbor, Thomas felt the ache of the morning's encounter. Not anger, but a quiet sorrow for a world that so often mistook kindness for weakness, dignity for defeat. Half an hour later, the marina fell silent as a Navy ship appeared on the horizon, its sleek form cutting through the water with undeniable authority. The laughter on the executive decision died away, replaced by uneasy murmurs. Harold's confident smirk faltered, his eyes darting toward the approaching vessel. The crowd's mocking energy dissolved, their phones lowered as they sensed something shifting in the air. Thomas, from his cottage, saw the ship too. A faint smile touched his lips, not out of triumph, but from a quiet understanding. The sea had a way of reminding people who truly commanded respect. The living room was a quiet shrine to a life of service, its shelves lined with relics of a storied naval career. Framed photographs captured moments of camaraderie. Young men in crisp uniforms, arms draped over each other's shoulders, their faces alight with the reckless optimism of youth. Medals gleamed in shadow boxes, their polished surfaces catching the faint light filtering through the curtains. In one corner, a folded American flag rested in a triangular case, its edges pristine, a silent testament to sacrifice. Thomas set his fishing tackle by the door, the worn bag slumping against the wall like an old friend. He crossed the room to the window, his steps slow but deliberate, and parted the curtains to gaze out at the harbor. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, a restless expanse that had always felt like home. Out there, the executive decision dominated the marina, its white hull dazzling against the blue. From its deck, the faint pulse of music and bursts of laughter carried on the breeze, evidence of a party that showed no signs of slowing. Thomas watched, his expression unreadable, though a faint ache stirred in his chest. Not envy, but something deeper. A quiet mourning for the simplicity of days long gone. His phone buzzed on the table, a rare interruption in the stillness of his routine. He glanced at the screen, seeing Mike Harrison's name, and felt a flicker of warmth. Mike, his old squadron mate, was one of the few who still reached out, his loyalty as steadfast as it had been decades ago. "Tom, you seen what they're posting about you online?" Mike's voice was gruff, laced with barely contained outrage, skipping any pleasantries. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he leaned against the windowsill. "What are you talking about?" Mike's indignation crackled through the line. "That jackass on the yacht, his kid posted a video of you. It's blowing up. Thousands of views already." Thomas's grip on his phone tightened, though his face remained calm. "A video?" Mike didn't pause. "They're mocking your boat, Tom, calling the sea memory a tetanus hazard, saying the Marina ought to have standards to keep junk like yours out. It's disrespect, plain and simple." Thomas exhaled, a long, weary sigh that carried the weight of years. "It's just a video, Mike." But Mike wasn't having it. "Disrespect, Tom. Don't they know who you are? What you did?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas moved to his armchair, its faded upholstery creaking as he eased himself down. Old injuries flared, a twinge in his knee, a dull ache in his shoulder. Reminders of a body that had endured more than most. "That was another lifetime," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet resignation. Mike's frustration boiled over. "I called some of the boys. This isn't right, Tom." Thomas shook his head, though Mike couldn't see it. "Leave it be, Mike. I'm too old for fights." He ended the call and sank deeper into the chair, the room growing dim as shadows stretched across the floor. His gaze drifted to the dresser across the room, where a Navy cross lay hidden in a drawer, its ribbon carefully folded. The citation had called it extraordinary heroism, praising his disregard for personal safety during a monsoon-soaked night off the coast of Vietnam. But to Thomas, it wasn't heroism, just necessity. When the sea had roared and lives hung in the balance, he'd done what needed doing, no more, no less. The memory was vivid, the sting of salt in his eyes, the howl of the wind, the desperate shouts of men clinging to wreckage. He'd acted without thought, driven by instinct and duty, but the cost lingered in his bones, in the quiet moments when the past refused to stay buried. Hunger finally pulled him from his thoughts. He rose, moving to the kitchen with the same measured steps, and prepared a simple meal. Grilled fish, a slice of bread, a glass of water. As he ate, his mind wandered back to that night in Vietnam, the chaos and the clarity of it. The metal had never felt like his. It belonged to the men who hadn't come back, the ones whose faces still haunted his dreams. He finished his meal in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the harbor outside. The next morning dawned clear, the sky a pale gold as the sun crept over the horizon. Thomas rose with it, as he had for 5 decades, his military habits etched into his soul. His routine was sacred. Coffee brewed strong and sipped on the porch, the weather report crackling through the radio, then a walk to the marina to check on the sea memory. The air was cool, carrying the tang of salt and diesel. As he approached the docks, he noticed an unusual buzz of activity. Harbor security officers were more visible than usual, their radios squawking faintly. A small crowd had gathered near the harbor master's office, their voices a low murmur. Thomas barely glanced their way. His mind was on the tide chart and a fishing spot he'd found last week, where the waters had teemed with promise. The executive decision was a hive of activity, its crew scurrying across the deck as they prepared for departure. From the flying bridge, Harold, the yacht's owner, barked orders, his gestures sharp and imperious. Thomas felt eyes on him as he passed, and when he glanced up, Harold's smirk was unmistakable. The man nudged his companion, who turned to look, his expression a mix of amusement and disdain. Thomas kept walking, his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead. Dignity was his armor, and he wore it well. At the commercial dock, the sea memory waited, her weathered hull a stark contrast to the gleaming yachts nearby. She was no beauty, her paint chipped and her deck worn, but she was his. Thomas moved through his morning ritual with care, checking the bilge pumps, inspecting the engine, arranging his fishing gear. Each task was a meditation, a way to ground himself in the present. He was about to cast off when a shadow fell across the deck. The harbor master stood on the dock, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a faint tension. "Morning, Thomas," he said, his voice careful. "Might want to hold off pushing out just yet." Thomas paused, his hand on the rope. "Problem with the channels?" The harbor master shook his head, gesturing toward the harbor entrance. "No, but you'll see in a minute." Thomas followed his gaze, squinting against the sun. On the horizon, a silhouette emerged, unmistakable even at a distance. The sharp angular profile of a naval vessel grew clearer with each passing moment, its gray hull cutting through the water with purpose. Thomas's breath caught, a strange tightness blooming in his chest. "That's a Burke-class destroyer," he murmured, more to himself than to the harbor master. "The USS Michael Murphy." The harbor master nodded, his voice low. "They called in this morning, requested emergency docking privileges, wouldn't say why." Thomas stood frozen, his eyes locked on the approaching warship. After 30 years, he could still read a ship's lines like a book, and this one stirred something deep within him. Pride, yes, but also a quiet unease. What was a destroyer doing in a place like this? The crowd on the shore grew, their murmurs rising as the ship loomed larger. Thomas felt the weight of their stares, but his focus remained on the Michael Murphy, her presence a riddle he couldn't yet solve. In that moment, as the warship's shadow stretched across the harbor, Thomas sensed a shift, as if the universe itself were stirring. The video, the mockery, the smirks, they were small things, petty slights in a world that had seen far greater injustices. But sometimes, he thought, the world had a way of balancing its scales, of delivering a reckoning when least expected. He stood on the deck of the Sea Memory, his hands steady, his heart a quiet drumbeat, and waited to see what the tide would bring. The USS Michael Murphy glided into Harbor Point with the kind of precision that only a U.S. Navy destroyer could muster, its massive steel frame slicing through the water like a silent promise of power. The Marina, usually alive with the carefree chatter of sailors and tourists, fell into a hushed reverence as the 505-foot warship settled near the entrance. Its sleek gray hull dwarfed the colorful yachts and fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, casting a shadow that seemed to demand respect. Sailors on smaller vessels paused their work, and tourists craned their necks, phones raised to capture the unexpected spectacle. Even the crew of the Executive Decision, a sleek yacht preparing to depart, stopped mid-motion, their captain, Harold, shielding his eyes against the sun to get a better look at the naval giant. The harbor's usual rhythm ground to a halt as the destroyer anchored with an almost unnatural grace for something so formidable. A small launch detached from the warship's side, cutting through the water with purpose as it headed toward the commercial dock. Thomas, a weathered man in faded fishing clothes, stood on the dock, his hands still on the rope he'd been tying. The harbor master, a grizzled man named Jim, leaned toward him, his voice low but heavy with something like awe. "Thomas, I reckon they're coming for you." Thomas's brow furrowed, his mind racing to make sense of the words. He opened his mouth to respond, but the launch reached the dock before he could. 6 sailors in crisp dress whites stepped ashore, their movements synchronized and sharp, followed by a tall woman whose commander's insignia gleamed in the sunlight. Her presence was magnetic, her posture radiating authority as she strode forward with unwavering focus. The crowd parted instinctively, their curiosity palpable. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. Thomas straightened, his body responding before his mind could catch up. Old military habits buried deep in his bones resurfacing. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but firm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. The woman stopped a few feet from him, her expression softening just enough to hint at warmth beneath her professionalism. "Commander Sarah Mitchell, USS Michael Murphy." She raised her hand in a crisp salute, her eyes locked on his. "We've come a long way to find you, sir." The Marina seemed to hold its breath. On the Executive Decision, Harold gripped on the railing of the flying bridge, his departure plans forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. The yacht's crew, including a young man who'd been filming the harbor for social media just moments before, stood frozen, their eyes darting between Thomas and the naval officers. The channel was blocked by the destroyer's presence, but no one complained. Something extraordinary was happening, and they all felt it. Thomas shook his head slightly, his weathered face etched with bewilderment. "I don't understand, ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now, almost lost in the gentle lapping of the waves against the dock. Commander Mitchell's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, as if she'd anticipated his reaction. 3 days ago, the Naval History Center digitized a batch of records from Vietnam-era special operations, she began, her voice carrying across the silent harbor. "Your name came up, Mr. Reynolds, tied to a designation we've been searching for over decades." She nodded to one of her officers, a young man who stepped forward holding a polished wooden case, his expression one of quiet reverence. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity now tinged with anticipation. "On May 4th, 1972, Mitchell continued, you commanded a classified mission to extract intelligence personnel from behind enemy lines. When your vessel was struck and caught fire, you swam through burning water to rescue 14 men, including Admiral James Holbrook." Thomas's face remained stoic, but something shifted in his eyes, a fleeting shadow of memory, raw and unburied. The weight of that night, the screams of his men, the searing heat of the flames licking at his skin, flickered through his mind like a film reel he'd long since locked away. He hadn't spoken of it in 50 years, not to his friends, not to his family, not even to the sea that had been his constant companion since. The crowd didn't notice the subtle tightening of his jaw, but Mitchell did. She pressed on, her voice steady but laced with respect. "Admiral Holbrook is now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff," she said. "When your records surfaced, he personally ordered us to locate you and ensure you received the recognition you were due. Your Navy Cross was documented, but it seems you never received the Presidential Unit Citation awarded to your entire team." The officer with the wooden case stepped closer, opening it with care to reveal a yellow document in a gleaming metal, its ribbon faded but intact. The sailor snapped to attention, rendering a salute so perfect it seemed to echo across the harbor. "With the Admiral's apologies for the 50-year delay, sir," he said, his voice ringing with pride. Thomas's hand twitched at his side, muscle memory kicking in as he returned the salute. His movements slower, but no less precise. For a moment, he wasn't a weathered fisherman in a sun-bleached shirt. He was a young officer, standing tall in a world of chaos and duty. The crowd watched in stunned silence, some beginning to piece together the weight of what they were seeing. On the executive decision, Harold's confusion gave way to a quiet, humbling realization. The young man beside him, his phone now forgotten in his hand, felt a pang of guilt for the casual mockery he'd aimed at Thomas the day before, his bravado draining away. Commander Mitchell wasn't finished. She gestured toward the destroyer, its silhouette looming like a monument to sacrifice. "There's more, sir," she said, her tone warm but formal. "Admiral Holbrook requested we extend an invitation. The USS Michael Murphy is headed to Pearl Harbor for a commemoration ceremony. 7 surviving members of your unit will be there, and the Admiral hopes you'll join them." A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft but electric. Even those with no military background could feel the significance of the moment, the rare honor being offered to a man who, until now, had been just another face in the Marina. Thomas's gaze drifted from Mitchell to the destroyer, then back to his own boat, the sea's memory. It was a humble vessel, her paint peeling and her deck worn from years of fishing trips and quiet nights under the stars. "She's not much to look at," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but she's been good to me." Mitchell's smile, genuine and full of understanding. "Sir," she said, "it would be the Murphy's honor to provide transportation, and I've taken the liberty of arranging for your boat to receive some maintenance while you're away. Naval engineers have a way of working wonders." Thomas stood still, his eyes tracing the lines of his boat as if seeking her counsel. The sea had been his refuge, a place where the past couldn't find him. Now the past had come ashore, dressed in white and bearing honors he'd never sought. He felt the weight of his younger self, the man who'd faced fire and death without flinching. Stirring somewhere deep inside, he thought of his men, the ones he'd saved and the ones he couldn't. their face had etched in his memory as clearly as the day he'd lost them. The invitation wasn't just to a ceremony, it was to face them again, to stand among the living and honor the dead. The crowd waited, their breath held, as Thomas's silence stretched. Finally he nodded, a small gesture that felt like the turning of a tide. "I'll go," he said simply, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Commander Mitchell's smile widened, and she nodded in return. "We'll make the arrangements, sir. The Murphy is ready when you are." As the sailors began to move back toward the launch, the Marina slowly stirred back to life. But the air was different now, charged with a quiet reverence. On the executive decision, Harold watched Thomas with new eyes, his heart heavy with the realization that he'd misjudged the man he'd dismissed as just another old fisherman. The young man beside him slipped his phone into his pocket, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet respect he couldn't quite articulate. Thomas turned back to, the sea's memory, his hand resting on her railing. The sea had kept his secrets for decades, but now it seemed she was ready to share his story. And as he looked out at the destroyer, waiting to carry him to Pearl Harbor, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of pride, tempered by the bittersweet ache of all that had been left behind. The air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel as a single pair of hands broke the stillness, clapping with a deliberate rhythm. The sound rippled outward, catching like wildfire until a wave of applause thundered across the harbor, reverberating over the gentle lapping of waves against weathered docks. Workers, their hands calloused from hauling nets and scrubbing decks, paused mid-task, their tools clattering to the ground as they joined the swelling ovation. Fishermen, their faces etched with lines from years under the relentless sun, doffed their caps in a quiet gesture of reverence, their eyes fixed on the figure at the heart of the moment. Across the marina near the gleaming luxury slips where polished yachts bobbed like trophies, Harold descended from the executive decisions bridge, his steps slow and heavy, as if each one carried the weight of his own misjudgments. His face, usually set in the confident lines of a man accustomed to command, was now clouded with unease, his brow furrowed with the discomfort of confronting a truth he'd long avoided. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been sharper. Harold, clad in tailored designer clothes that spoke of wealth and privilege, approached Thomas, whose faded canvas pants and threadbare shirt bore the marks of a life spent wrestling with the sea. Yet it was Thomas who stood at the center of the Navy's respect, his quiet dignity drawing every eye. The crowd's applause seemed to wrap around him like a shield, and though his weathered face betrayed no hint of pride, there was a steadiness in his gaze that spoke of a man who had faced far worse than the scrutiny. "Mr. Reynolds," Harold began, his voice catching awkwardly in his throat, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He shifted his weight, unaccustomed to humility, his polished shoes scuffing against the rough dock. "I believe I owe you an apology." The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw, and for a moment Harold's eyes flickered with something like shame. A man grappling with the realization that his wealth and status had blinded him to the worth of the man before him. Thomas regarded him silently, his expression unreadable, as if weighing not just Harold's words, but the heart behind them. Then, with a grace born of hard-won wisdom, he extended his hand. "No harm done to either vessel," he said simply, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of a sailor's creed. "That's what matters." The words were not a rebuke, yet they struck Harold with a force no accusation could match. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if a burden he hadn't known he carried had been lifted, replaced by a quiet awe for the man who offered forgiveness so effortlessly. He clasped Thomas's hand, the calluses of one meeting the manicured softness of the other, and for a fleeting moment, the divide between them seemed to dissolve. Stepping back, Harold retreated into the crowd as Commander Mitchell took his place, his presence commanding yet warm, his uniform crisp against the backdrop of the weathered marina. As the commander's voice rang out, reading the citation, the crowd leaned in, hungry for the fragments of a story few had known until now. The words painted a vivid picture, a night mission in hostile waters gone horribly wrong, a young lieutenant who refused to abandon his men despite the chaos of gunfire and the weight of his own wounds. They heard of a grueling trek through enemy territory, of a badly injured officer carried to safety on the back of a man who should have faltered, but didn't. Each detail was a brushstroke in a portrait of courage, and Thomas, standing quietly at the center, seemed almost to shrink from the attention, his eyes fixed on some distant point across the water. His thoughts drifted back to those dark nights, the screams of the wounded, the relentless fear that gnawed at his resolve, and the stubborn refusal to let it win. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero then, nor did he now. He'd simply done what needed doing, and the weight of that choice had shaped every year since. "Your country honors your service, Lieutenant Reynolds," Commander Mitchell concluded, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But more than that, we remember it. True worth isn't measured by what we possess, but by what we're willing to sacrifice. What matters more, the size of your vessel or the courage of your journey?" The words hung in the air, a challenge and a tribute, and the crowd erupted once more, their applause a testament to a truth they felt in their bones. Thomas nodded slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if acknowledging the words without fully accepting their weight. Inside, he felt the familiar ache of old wounds, not just the physical scars, but the ones carved into his soul, the memories of comrades lost and the quiet guilt of having survived. A month later, when the USS Michael Murphy had long since sailed from Harbor Point, Thomas returned. The man who stepped onto the dock was subtly different, his posture straighter, as if he'd finally set down a burden he'd carried for decades. The lines on his weathered face seemed less heavy, touched with a healthy flush that spoke of renewed purpose. His movements carried a quiet confidence, not the brash swagger of youth, but the steady assurance of a man who had faced his past and found peace in it. The sea memory, his old fishing boat, awaited him, but she was no longer the weathered relic he'd left behind. Naval engineers had worked their magic, preserving her soul while breathing new life into her bones. Her hull gleamed with fresh blue paint, vibrant against the gray of the harbor, and new canvas stretched taut over her deck, shielding it from the elements. Her mechanical systems, once creaking with age, now hummed with the precision of military craftsmanship. At her helm, a small brass plaque gleamed, simple yet profound. Lieutenant Thomas Reynolds, USN, Vietnam, 1972. He ran his fingers over the engraved words, his heart tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. Memories of that distant war flickering like ghosts in his mind. Harbor Point itself had changed in his absence. The harbor master greeted him with a warmth that bordered on reverence, his usual gruffness softened by newfound respect. He explained how the Marina had launched a Veterans Appreciation Program, offering reduced fees to those who had served. 3 retired service members had already claimed slips, their modest boats now nestled among the gleaming yachts that had once dominated the Marina. The transformation extended even to the Executive Decisions Bridge, where Harold had made changes of his own. Gone was the ostentatious nameplate that had once proclaimed his yacht's grandeur. In its place was a simpler design, understated and sincere. Harold himself had started a program to take disadvantaged youth on maritime excursions, his eyes alight with a purpose he hadn't known he lacked. The young man who had once recorded a video that shamed Thomas now volunteered at the local library, collecting oral histories from veterans, his own perspective shifted by the weight of their stories. Thomas slipped back into his quiet life with little fanfare. He still rose with the dawn to fish, the rhythm of the sea as familiar as his own heartbeat. His modest cottage, perched above the water, remained his sanctuary, its walls lined with memories he rarely spoke of. Yet something had shifted. Young sailors began seeking him out, drawn by whispers of his past. They sat with him on the dock, listening as he shared understated tales of naval operations from another era, his voice steady but distant, as if recounting someone else's life. Local children, too, began to approach, their curiosity sparked by the sea memory's new luster. Thomas never turned them away, patiently teaching them to tie proper knots or read the subtle signs of approaching weather, his hands steady as he guided theirs. Each interaction was a small act of service, a way to honor the past without dwelling in it. The Presidential Unit citation, once hidden in a dresser drawer, now hung on the wall of Harbor Point's community center, surrounded by a growing collection of photographs from local veterans inspired to share their own stories. Thomas had placed it there not out of pride but because it felt right, a way to let the past breathe rather than suffocate in silence. When asked about his time in Hawaii, where he'd attended a reunion at Pearl Harbor, he offered little, his voice soft with the weight of complex emotions. Reunions are a mixed bag, he'd say, his eyes drifting to the horizon. Pressed about the ceremony, he'd offer a faint smile and a simple truth. Some memories are best honored by keeping on, not by standing still. On quiet evenings, residents might spot him on the Sea Memories deck, standing alone as the sun dipped below the horizon, his silhouette framed against the fading light. In those moments, he was both the young lieutenant who had carried his men to safety and the old sailor who had finally found his way home. The sea his constant companion, whispering truths only he could hear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the vast expanse of the sky, Mr. Reynolds stood with a quiet, unwavering patience, a patience forged in the crucible of countless storms, both those born of nature's fury and those ignited by human cruelty. His silhouette, framed against the fading light, was a study in resilience. His back was straight, not out of rigidity, but from a deep-seated strength, yet his shoulders carried an ease that spoke of a man who had made peace with the weight of his years. There was no trace of bitterness in his stance, no clenching of fists or furrowing of brows. Instead, there was a serene acceptance, a harmony with his past, his present, and whatever fragment of the future still lay ahead. He wasn't here to demand the world's attention or to proclaim his triumphs. He simply existed, as he always had, with a dignity that didn't shout but whispered, enduring through time like the steady rhythm of the tides. Dignity, Mr. Reynolds seemed to embody, wasn't about commanding a room or forcing others to take notice. It was quieter, subtler, yet infinitely more powerful. It was the way he carried himself, not with arrogance, but with an unspoken certainty of his own worth, a worth that had been overlooked, dismissed, and trampled upon by so many for so long. His presence was a testament to survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. Each wrinkle etched into his weathered face told a story of battles fought, some won, some lost, but all endured. His eyes, though tired, held a spark of something unyielding, a refusal to let the world strip him of his humanity. To stand beside him was to feel the weight of his quiet strength, a strength that didn't need validation, but commanded respect all the same. Respect, as Mr. Reynolds' life seemed to teach, wasn't measured in loud applause or grandiose gestures. It wasn't found in fleeting moments of recognition or in medals pinned to a chest. No, respect was something deeper, something earned in the silent acknowledgement of a person's inherent value, a value too often ignored by a world quick to judge and slow to understand. It was in the way people now paused when they saw him, their eyes lingering not with pity, but with a newfound reverence for a man whose story had finally begun to surface. For years, his worth had been buried beneath the indifference of others, yet he had never wavered. He had carried on, not for the sake of glory, but because to do otherwise would have been to betray himself. And in that quiet perseverance, he had become a living lesson in what it meant to truly stand tall. When I first learned of Mr. Reynolds' story, it stirred something deep within me, a memory that felt both personal and universal. My mind drifted to my grandfather, a World War II veteran whose own life had been shaped by the same unyielding principles of dignity and respect, like Mr. Reynolds. My grandfather had faced his own battles, not just on distant battlefields, but in the quieter, more insidious struggles of a world that often failed to see him for who he was. I could still hear his voice, steady and measured, as he spoke of the importance of holding one's head high, no matter the cost. He believed that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you lived, day after day, even when the world turned its back. Seeing Mr. Reynolds now, standing resolute against the backdrop of the setting sun, I felt a pang of recognition. Here was a man who, like my grandfather, had weathered the storms of life with a grace that defied explanation. Their stories, though separated by time and circumstance, were bound by the same thread of resilience, a resilience that refused to be broken, no matter how fierce the winds blew. Mr. Reynolds' life was a mirror, reflecting a truth I couldn't ignore. The fight for justice is a flame that must never be allowed to flicker out. His story wasn't just a tale of personal triumph, it was a call to action, a reminder that the work of righting wrongs is never done. To stand up for what is just, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means facing the scorn of others or the weight of one's own fears is a duty we all share. Mr. Reynolds hadn't sought out this role as a beacon of inspiration, yet here he was, his quiet strength radiating a challenge to those who witnessed it. His life asked us to be better, to listen more intently, to act with a compassion that sees beyond the surface. It urged us to recognize the worth in others, especially those whose voices have been silenced or whose stories have been buried beneath the noise of the world. In sharing Mr. Reynolds' story, we had done more than recount a series of events. We had given voice to a man whose life deserved to be heard, whose struggles and triumphs deserved to be known. But it was you, the listener, who breathed meaning into his tale. By pausing to hear his story, by allowing it to touch your heart and stir your conscience, you became part of its legacy. You ensured that Mr. Reynolds' quiet dignity would ripple outward, touching lives he might never meet. And for that, dear fam, there is only gratitude, a deep, heartfelt thanks for seeing him, for understanding him, and for carrying his story forward into a world that so desperately needs its lessons.